So thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thanks to Ralph Pike for inviting me, and to Rob Crow for making the transition to Bristol so easy. So, yes, this is drawn from the book that I'm working on now, which is about, well, started out to be about wildness, and very soon I realized that wildness and not wildness were kind of inextricably combined. The book will include all those things that you just heard, but the talk actually, I think, doesn't. I'm also thinking about changes in the understanding of wildness, that what difference does that change make? What difference does it make to the animals who are classified one way or another? What difference does it make to us? It's a subject that is related in a way to the discussion of wilderness, which has been elaborated by environmental historians over the past few decades, and I'll come back to that briefly later. But it's not centrally part of that discussion, and one of the things that sets it apart is the relation of wildness, as I said, to its opposite. That is, you can't think about wildness in terms of animals without thinking, well, what would make an animal not wild? And maybe the plethora of words for the alternative category, at least in English, which include domesticated, tame, captive, and a little further afield, feral, is an indication of the ambiguity, therefore the interest, inherent in all of these categories. Anyway, so to begin with a poem, or with a reference to a poem, The Destruction of Sennacherib, written by Byron in 1815, he began, "The Assyrian came down like a wolf, like the wolf on the fold." Now, his audience in 1815 would not have been acquainted with wolves. In fact, the flocks in Britain had not been threatened with wolves since before the Wars of the Roses, but nevertheless, they didn't have any trouble understanding that simile or feeling its force. And almost 2 centuries later, that is now, expressions like "the wolf is at the door" remain evocative, although our Anglophone experience of wolves has diminished for the most part still further. For most of us, we only encounter them, if we encounter them at all, in zoos or in establishments like a place called Wolf Hollow, which is located in Ipswich, Massachusetts, just north of Boston, where there's a pack of gray wolves that live a sheltered suburban existence behind a high chain-link fence. Their Massachusetts existence, of course, their captivity has produced some modification of their nomadic habits, their fierce, independent disposition, as you can see. Their relationship with their caretakers seems affectionate and playful, sometimes even as you look at it, engagingly dog-like, so much so that visitors have to be warned that it would be dangerous for a stranger to presume on this superficial affability and try, for example, to kiss the wolf yourself. The animals do give occasional indications that they retain the capacities or the inclinations of their free-roaming relatives. That is, that though they are apparently reconciled to their confinement, they're far from tame. So when large, loud vehicles rumble past on Route 133, which is a nearby highway, the wolves tend to howl. And in fact, for a while when you went to their website, the website would open with a howl. And despite the fact that they're securely enclosed within a built-up landscape of typical North American sprawl, their calls still evoke, in a way, the eerie menace that has echoed through, traditionally, through the wild woods of fairy tales and fables. So the symbolic resonance of large, ferocious wild animals, the traditional representatives of what seems most threatening about the natural world, has thus proved much more durable than their physical presence. And in fact, their absence has often had kind of equal and opposite figurative force. And so the extermination of wolves in Great Britain, along with other unruly creatures such as bears and wild boars, was routinely cited as evidence of the triumph of insular, as opposed to continental, civilization in the early modern period. So there is an imagination of a medieval wolf hunt in Britain. And as they dispersed around the globe, British settlers and colonizers set themselves parallel physical and metaphorical challenges, conflating the elimination of dangerous animals with the imposition of political and military order. In North America, for example, hunters could claim bounties for killing wolves from the 17th century into the 20th, although by the latter period, the wolves had abandoned or had been eliminated from most of their historic range, persisting only in remote mountains, forests, and tundras. And this is a U.S. government wolf hunter and his bag. In Africa, and especially in Asia, imperial officials celebrated the extermination of wild beasts as one of the undoubted advantages derived from British rule. And this is Jim Corbett, the young Jim Corbett, with one of his dead tigers. He later had a conversion experience after he killed quite a lot of tigers. Anyway, the shift in European sensibility that transformed rugged mountains into objects of admiration rather than disgust it's a commonplace of the history of aesthetics. So, for example, in the early 18th century, even the relatively modest hikes, modest to North American eyes at least, of what's now known as the English Lake District impressed the traveling author Daniel Defoe, as he said, eminent only for being the wildest, most barren and frightful of any that I have passed over in England, or even in Wales itself. So here is one of those frightful peaks. But the increasingly romantic tourists who followed him gradually learned to appreciate this harsh, dramatic landscape, so that a century later, the noted literary opium eater Thomas de Quincey could characterize the vistas that had horrified Defoe as a paradise of virgin beauty. Of course, this altered perception had complex roots, but it's suggestive that it coincided with improvements in transportation and in the infrastructure of tourism, and in a general way, as economic and technological developments made the world seem safer and more comfortable, it became possible to experience some of its extremes as thrilling rather than terrifying. Or to put it another way, as nature began to seem a less overwhelming opponent, the valence of its traditional symbols began to change. Ultimately, but much later, after their population numbers and also their geographical ranges had been radically reduced, even wild predators began to benefit from this reevaluation. So the ferocity and danger that was associated with wolves and their figurative ilk became a source of glamour, evoking admiration and sympathy from a wide range of people who were unlikely ever to encounter them. As representatives of the unsettled landscapes in which they'd managed to survive, they started to inspire nostalgia rather than antagonism. And this tendency was marked by the middle of the 19th century. So a naturalist whose name was James Edmund Harding devoted an entire book to them. He called it British Animals Extinct Within Historic Times, and this is an early edition of it. And in it he explained, he said, the moors and woods and glens which we now traverse so securely were infested with ferocious animals, not just wolves, but also bears and wild boars. And you can see there's a wild boar on the cover of this book, although it's being attacked in more or less the way of pig sticking in India at that time. And of course, the wild boars are back now, although I think these are escapees from a farm. Anyway, his reflections clearly indicated that he was at least of two minds about these developments, about the elimination of dangerous wild animals. So he had chosen his topic with nostalgia as well as with relief. And although English life was surely easier and more efficient without these creatures, it could also seem, at least in the eyes of someone like him, somewhat diminished. So to quote him again, he said, "The interest which attaches to the history of extinct British animals can only be equaled by the regret which must be felt by all true naturalists at their disappearance beyond recall from our fauna." So anyway, I've been using several terms as though their meanings were clear and definite, when in fact they're contested and ambiguous. Of course, this is not a unique situation. Potter Stewart, who is a former justice of the US Supreme Court, famously said of hardcore pornography that it was hard to define, but he knew it when he saw it. And his process of discrimination was far from unique with regard to pornography. Many people feel similar confidence in their own reaction, but this gut consensus has not led to shared definitions or universally accepted policies. That is to say, when they see any particular it, some people know it and some people don't. And a parallel juxtaposition of convergent method and divergent results exists with regard to wild animals. Even people accustomed to think critically about the more general notion of wilderness often rely on less consciously formulated criteria to categorize a particular animal or group of animals as wild. And as is the case with pornography, there are some good reasons for this inconsistency. Both pornography and wild animals inspire strong and diverse emotions, and both are genuinely difficult to define and delimit, and that's all I'm going to say about pornography. So wild, for example, it collocates with several terms that are similarly indeterminate and evocative. It's often been repeated that the cultural critic Raymond Williams characterized nature, the word nature, as perhaps the most complex word in the English language. The term wilderness is similarly problematic, as I suggested before. In the context of conservation or restoration, it often occurs in conjunction with words like pristine and untouched, and therefore it implies a condition that's both primeval and unchanged. And this connotation suggests that the first task of landscape stewards should be to identify this condition of primeval wilderness, but even a moderately long chronological perspective suggests that any such effort is bound to be quixotic. The environment in which, for example, modern wild animals have evolved has never been stable. In the north, less than 20,000 years ago, much of North America and Eurasia was covered by glaciers, and glaciers much thicker than any that are around today. So, glaciers, or non-glaciers actually. And after their gradual release from the burden of several miles of ice in many places and water, most of the northern lands continued to experience significant shifts in topography and also in climate, and therefore in flora and fauna. These natural changes have been supplemented for thousands of years by the impact of human activity. So the theoretical and political problems that are presented by wilderness are even knottier than the definitional ones. And in a groundbreaking essay that was published several decades ago, the environmental historian William Cronin argued that wilderness and civilization, or garden as he called it, were not mutually exclusive opposites, but rather they form part of a single continuum. So he said, far from being absolute, the one place on earth that stands apart from humanity, wilderness was itself a quite profoundly human creation. So, if wilderness and landscape has been thus persuasively to me, although it remains controversial, and I don't know that it has much pragmatic effect on the way people have treated landscapes. Anyway, it has been persuasively problematized. I don't think the same can be said, at least not so systematically, for wildness in animals. The Oxford English Dictionary defines the adjective wild unambiguously, and it emphasizes its zoological application. So the first sense refers to animals. It says, living in a state of nature, not tame, not domesticated, opposite to tame. And in what I think is a standard, although disappointing, lexicographical move, tame is defined with equal confidence and complete circularity, as also the first sense, reclaimed from the wild, brought under the control and care of man, domestic, domesticated, opposite to wild. But outside the dictionary, these terms are harder to pin down, and their interrelationships, I think, are more complicated. So one famous, if somewhat reductive, use of this relationship or set of relationships occurs in the powerful analogy between artificial selection and natural selection with which Charles Darwin introduced On the Origin of Species. That is, he knew that his readers, both lay and expert, would be familiar with the practices employed by breeders to improve elite livestock and pets, and he hoped that it wouldn't be too difficult for them to imagine a situation in which human judgment had been replaced by the harsher or more basic pressures exerted by nature. And Darwin actually continued his parallel investigation of variation under domestication after he wrote The Origin. It resulted in one of his longest, although I would say least read books, published about a decade later, The Variation of Animals and Plants under Domestication. Anyway, the parallel between wild species and domesticated breeds was and is far from complete, however, and the combination of similarity and difference that made Darwin's juxtaposition of wild and domesticated both effective and somewhat misleading still persists. Indeed, as human impact on the environment has become increasingly pervasive, the reciprocal resonance of these categories has intensified. The animal wild becomes more appealing as it becomes less available or less wild. And as the valence of wildness has altered, the stakes around its definition have increased. That is, as it's become appealing rather than the reverse, with implications for enterprises as diverse as livestock breeding and environmental conservation. So, like Cronin's Wilderness and Garden, the wild and the tamed or domesticated exist along a continuum in a world where human environmental influence extends to the highest latitudes and to the deepest seas. Few animal lives remain untouched by it. So at least in this absolute sense, few can be said to be completely wild. And as the valence of the wild has increased, its definition has become more obviously a matter of assertion rather than description, and the boundaries of domestication have blurred as well. Which is not to say that they were ever clear. As 21st century wolves belong to a long line of animals whose wildness has been compromised, tameness has conversely also existed on a sliding scale. Now, according to the OED, again, both wild and tame have persisted for a millennium. They've remained fairly constant in form, as well as in core meaning, while the language around them has mutated beyond easy comprehension, if not beyond recognition, and by that I mean simply that most of us need training to read the English of 1,000 years ago. But this robustness on the level of abstraction has cloaked imprecision and ambiguity on the level of application or reference. So although medieval farmers and hunters may have had no trouble distinguishing livestock animal from game or vermin, the two subcategories of wild animals that they were likely to employ, it would have been difficult to extract any general definition of any of those terms from their use of those categories. The impact of domestication varied from kind to kind, as well as from individual creature to individual creature. So the innate aggression of the falcons and ferrets who assisted human hunters was merely channeled, not transformed, and when they weren't working, they were confined, like wild animals, in menageries. Then as now, people existed more influence over their dogs than over their cats, who were mostly allowed to follow their own instincts with regard to reproduction and also with regard to rodents. Medieval cattle, the producers of labor, as well as of meat, milk, and hides, led more constrained lives to some extent than did contemporary sheep, and pigs were often left to forage in the woods like the wild boars whom they closely resembled. And with hindsight, things become even a little more complicated. That is, the domesticated cattle of the Middle Ages could appear undomesticated to later people, especially as wildness began to gain in glamour. So by the late 18th century, for example, a few small herds of unruly wild cattle who were allowed to roam like deer through the parks of their wealthy owners became celebrated as aboriginal and wild. As the Earl of Tankerville, whose Chillingham breed herd was the most famous, put it, his wild cattle, these guys, or actually, this is a nuclear family, not exactly the way cattle live, and so only one of them is a guy. His wild cattle were the ancient breed of the island, enclosed long since within the boundary of the park. The ancient breed was sometimes alleged to be the mighty aurochs, the extinct ancestor of all domestic cattle, which had been eliminated in Britain by Bronze Age hunters, and I'll come back to them in a while. Anyway, but calling them descended from the aurochs allegedly gave these herds ancestry distinct from that of ordinary domestic cattle. And to increase or underscore their distinctiveness, these cattle were never milked, and if their meat was required for ceremonial occasions, such as the coming of age of a human heir, they were hunted and shot, not ignominiously slaughtered. Or sometimes they were allowed to be shot as a great treat for distinguished visitors. This is the Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VII. Throughout the 19th century, their autochthonous nobility continued to inspire the effusions of distinguished poets and painters, such as Sir Walter Scott and Sir Edward Landseer, who painted that picture, as well as the expenditure of newly wealthy landowners eager to bask by association in the prestige of apparent wild nobility and ancient descent. But even at the height of their renown, it was clear that their claims to wildness included a large measure of wishful thinking. Skeptics wondered persuasively whether, even assuming that the 19th century emparked herds lived in a state of nature, that state represented a historical constant or a relatively modern restoration. Anybody who actually went to the trouble of investigating the background of the herds concluded that they were feral at best, that is to say, at wildness. That is, they were the descendants of domesticated animals who had happened not to be fenced in when most, that is, they continued to live in the way that medieval domesticated animals lived, which to people in the 18th century looked relatively wild. Modern anatomical and genetic research has confirmed these doubts, and it firmly connects these white herds with the ordinary domestic cattle. But so great is the continuing appeal of wildness, and I must say, so limited is the persuasive force of scientific evidence, that a recent president of the Chillingham Wild Cattle Association has nevertheless asserted that although there is still much that is not known about the origin of the Chillingham wild cattle, one fact that is certain is that they were never domesticated. And there they are. You can see them if you go there. Only a few people, of course, possess the kind of resources that were required to express their admiration for the wild on this kind of scale. But numerous alternative options emerged for those with more restrictive acres and purses. An increasing variety of exotic animals stocked private menageries. Of course, the largest of those were sufficiently grand to actually accommodate large animals. So this is the cheetahs kept by George III, and these are some elk in the menagerie of the 13th Earl of Derby, who had the largest private menagerie in Britain in the 19th century. Smaller animals, though, required more modest quarters, and parrots, monkeys, canaries, and even the celebrated but ill-fated wombats of the poet Dante Gabriel Rossetti. This is Rossetti's own picture of himself weeping over his dead wombat. Could be acquired and treated as pets. Breeders of barnyard animals sometimes attempted to enhance or invigorate their livestock with infusions of exotic blood. So if they were unable to maintain their old wild sire for a brief period in the 1820s and 30s, they could pay a stud fee to the farm of the newly established Zoological Society of London and get the services of a zebu cow, or bull, I should say, or a zebra. In Australia, Russia, Algeria, and the United States, as well as in Britain and France, the Acclimatization Society of the late 19th century targeted an impressive range of species for transportation and domestication, from the predictable, that is exotic deer and wild sheep, that is similar to animals that were actually domesticated, to the more imaginative, such as yaks, camels, and tapirs. So difficult or so undesirable had it become to distinguish between wild animals and tame ones that exotic breeds of domestic dogs were exhibited in Victorian zoos, and small wild felines like ocelots were exhibited in some early cat shows. And the popular appeal of wild animals has continued to increase as they've become more accessible, either in the flesh or in the media. So entangled have wildness and domesticity become that it's now necessary to warn visitors to North American parks that roadside bears may bite the hands that feed them. And it's now possible for domesticated animals to represent nature. This extended symbolic reach was demonstrated in 2001 when, as at least the older ones of you probably remember, foot and mouth disease struck British livestock. Because the disease spreads rapidly and easily, the government prescribed the cull not only of all infected herds and flocks, but of apparently healthy livestock that were living in their vicinity. Outbreaks were widespread, but the largest number occurred in the Lake District, the dramatic landscape that had been disparaged by Defoe and praised by De Quincey. And it so happened that the ovine victims, the sheep, had iconic status, or at least a lot of them did. They were members of the Herdwick breed that, and the cull seemed to threaten its very survival. There are a lot of them, but almost all of them live in just a rather confined geographical area. It wasn't exactly that no other sheep could live in the Lake District, because actually they look a lot like some other hill breeds, and presumably they could be replaced. But their special claim was a kind of mystical connection to their native ground. So not only were the sheep acknowledged to possess detailed topographical information about the hills they inhabited, but they were said to mystically transmit it down the generations from ewe to lamb. This kind of connection was so well recognized that when farms were sold, the purchaser had to buy the sheep, whether wanted them or not, on the theory that if they were taken away, they would just come back. And despite strong historical indication that the ancestral Herdwicks arrived in the vicinity of the Lake District by boat, and the further fact that all British sheep descend from wild mouflons that were originally domesticated in the eastern Mediterranean region, they were traditionally celebrated as indigenous, peculiar to that high exposed rocky mountainous district. An article in the preeminent Victorian Agricultural Journal asserted that the Herdwicks possessed more of the characters of an original race than any other in the county, and that they showed no marks of kindred with any other race. And most of the 21st century journalists who reported on the threatened cull uncritically adopted similar rhetoric. So as the sheep were nativized, they were also naturalized. A reporter for the Independent newspaper feared that if the Herdwicks disappeared, the whole ecology of the region might be changed, he said, beyond recognition. And actually, since the uplands of the Lake District have been shaped by nibbling sheep for about a millennium, this concern was not completely unreasonable, or it wouldn't be if other sheep wouldn't have taken their place. So whether they were technically indigenous or not, and although they're incontestably domesticated, the Herdwicks have become compelling symbols of the apparently untamed landscape they inhabit, more compelling, apparently, than the numerous actually wild birds and small mammals with which they share it. Like the landscape itself, they seem wilder than they are. That is, they appear to be independent and free-ranging, but their lives, and in fact their very existence, are ultimately determined by human economic exigencies. So they're both accessible, that there are a lot of them, and they're everywhere, not just in the fields, but even like sleeping on the roads. And they're also inaccessible. That is, they're skittish and they retreat if you approach them. So the assault on the Herdwick sheep was perceived as an attack on both the domesticated countryside and the unspoiled natural landscape. So in both the sheep and their environment, the wild and the tame had inextricably merged. Okay, now to shift a bit. If vernacular usage illustrates the increasing slippage between wildness and tameness in animals, scientific classification has made a similar point from the opposite direction. The species concept has a long and vexed history. The study of natural history, or botany and zoology, requires that individual kinds be labeled, otherwise you can't talk about them. But for many plants and animals, the large number that, unlike, I should say, giraffes, have very similar relatives. That is, giraffes are easy to distinguish from non-giraffes. It's been difficult for naturalists to tell where one kind ends and another kind begins. The classification of domesticated animals has epitomized this problem. That is, none of them has become sufficiently different from its wild ancestor to preclude the production of fertile offspring, which is the conventional, although completely problematic, definition of the line between species. And some of them mate happily with much more distant relatives. 19th century zookeepers, in fact, enjoyed experimenting along these lines, and zookeepers were able to admire the resulting hybrids between horses and zebras, domestic cattle and bison, dogs and wolves, different kinds of monkeys, et cetera, the kind of thing that no zookeeper would dream of doing now. But despite these persuasive demonstrations of kinship, from the 18th century emergence of modern taxonomy, classifiers have ordinarily allotted each type of domestic animal its own species name. While recognizing the theoretical difficulties that this produces, most modern taxonomists have continued in this, with this practice. So domestic sheep are still Ovis aries, while the mouflon is Ovis orientalis, the dog is Canis familiaris, the wolf is Canis lupus, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The archaeozoologist Juliette Cotton-Brock explained this practice as efficient. That is, there's a lot of books and so forth that use this kind of distinction. It would be very confusing to change all the nomenclature, and as well as scientifically grounded, at least to some extent, since at least that humans have erected barriers between domestic animal populations and their wild relatives. And in fact, people who study the origins of domestication say that that's one of the first steps in that process. But it also constitutes a simultaneous acknowledgement of the artificiality of the distinction between wild animals and domestication, and of the importance and power of that distinction. So in this case, vernacular understandings have trumped understandings based on anatomy and physiology. The implications of making or not making such distinctions extend beyond the intellectual realm. They construct the physical world at the same time as they describe it. So although the howls of the wolf may retain their primordial menace, the wolves who make them have long vanished from most of their vast original range, and they're threatened in much of their remaining territory. In the continental United States, they're threatened everywhere, if they exist at all. So to persist or to return, they need human protection, and not only physical protection, but legal protection and taxonomic protection. With the advent of DNA analysis in recent decades, the taxonomic stakes have risen so that even animals who look wild and act wild may be found genetically unworthy. So efforts to preserve the red wolf, which had a historical distribution throughout the southeastern US, and maybe even a bit further north, have been complicated by suggestions that it's not a separate species but a hybrid of the gray wolf and the coyote. No such aspersions have been cast on the pedigree of the gray wolf, but nevertheless, every attempted wolf restoration has triggered human resistance, and local challenges to their endangered status inevitably follow even moderate reintroduction success. If domesticated dogs were returned to their ancestral taxon, wolves would become one of the commonest animals in the United States and not one of the rarest. So their survival as wild animals depends on the dog's continuing definition as domesticated. But as wildness has become increasingly attractive, mere survival has ceased to satisfy some of its advocates. They've gone beyond preservation to embrace resurrection and rewilding. To return, as I promised, to the aurochs, which was the larger and more ferocious ancestor of all currently extant domestic cattle, not just the so-called wild Chillinghams. There is a skeleton in a museum from a museum in Denmark. Their extinction is relatively recent. 1637, I believe, was the last one. So there's a lot of evidence about them, not just physical remains like this skeleton, but lots of human records, some of them dating from many thousands of years ago. So this is one from the cave paintings at Lascaux. Somewhat paradoxically, the refinements in the theory and practice of domesticated animal breeding that were developed in the course of the 18th and 19th centuries have inspired a series of attempts to resurrect the aurochs, thus indirectly many more recent rewilding endeavors. So in the 1920s and 30s, two German brothers, both zoo directors, Heinz and Lutz Heck, attempted to recreate the aurochs by breeding back from various European breeds that they identified as having retained primitive characteristics. Now, primitive is also an interesting word, although not for today. They proceeded separately. One was based in Munich, one was based in Berlin. They began with different ideas of what the original aurochs had looked like. They chose different breeds as their raw material, and they nurtured them in somewhat different settings, a zoo versus a field or pasture. Each of them produced what they said was an aurochs. They weren't the same, but each of them liked the other ones, or so they said. People who have observed them from a greater distance have been more critical. Sometimes the criticism was practical. That is, both brothers concentrated on superficial characteristics like color and shape of the horn, and neither one of them kept careful records of the pedigree of their animals. And this is a critique. Basically, the little ones are the Heck cattle, and the big ones are what the aurochs was really like. So basically, this critique is that they weren't big enough. And some of the criticism was political, since both brothers were ultimately associated with the National Socialist regime, and the symbolism surrounding this allegedly primordial European animal was readily incorporated into Nazi ideology. And this is Lutz Heck with a bunch of senior Nazis. Lutz is on the left, and Goering is on the right. The photograph comes from a catalog published to accompany the 1937 International Hunting Exposition that was held in Berlin. Now, Goering was a big fan of this kind of thing. He dreamed of introducing the reconstituted aurochs into the forest in the eastern part of Poland to supplement the surviving population there of elk, deer, and other animals. And this is a statue that he had commissioned for his own estate in Eastern Prussia. It's meant to be actually a combination of the European bison and the North American bison, a hybrid. Now, although the reputation of the Heck brothers was greatly diminished after World War II, their cattle have continued to enjoy a kind of niche esteem. There are a few herds scattered across Europe, mostly, I think, just because people like them. So this is a herd of them in Germany. But they're also in places like Oostvaardersplassen in the Netherlands, where there's been an attempt to recreate a pre-agricultural or maybe even a Pleistocene landscape. They fill the niche, possibly just aesthetic, but maybe also ecological, that sometimes is assigned to highland cattle, which are hairier than most domesticated cattle, but otherwise no wilder than Chillinghams. And in fact, the Heck cattle may be in the process of supplanting them in this role. An announcement of their arrival in Britain in 2009 inspired the somewhat mischievous headline of an article in The Times, which combined both sets of associations, the political and the prehistoric. The headline was "A Shaggy Cow Story, How a Nazi Experiment Brought the Extinct Aurochs to Devon." And actually, The Times was being restrained, as you can see from some other reportage. And you might have noticed that this herd was in the news just last year. So there was a headline in The Independent that said, Nazi super cows, British farmers forced to destroy half his murderous herd of bioengineered heck cows after they tried to kill staff. Here are the murderous herd. And he also said that they made very tasty sausages that tasted a bit like venison. So even in their disaggregated and processed state, they retained a kind of whiff of the wild. So the discrediting of the Heck brothers' efforts therefore hasn't meant the end of these kind of attempts at resurrection. On the contrary, rewilding is every place these days. And the Heck brothers themselves, who both lived into the 1980s, were also not discouraged by their unfortunate experiences. In the post-war period, Lutz, the one who was the director of the Munich Zoo until 1945, paid a visit to Namibia, the former German Southwest Africa, which he described in a book entitled Grosswild in Etoshaland, published in 1955. Now, at that time, and for about the previous century, the most conspicuous extinction in southern Africa had been the quagga. And this had been a particularly shocking extinction because it had been particularly rapid, as was the case pretty much at the same time with the North American bison and the passenger pigeon. It almost seemed like 1 year there were a lot of these animals, and then the next year there were none, or only a few sorry captives in European zoos. As you can see, what it looks like is an inadequately striped zebra. And in fact, it's recently been reclassified as a subspecies of the plain zebra, which therefore, due to the arcane rules of taxonomy, is now labeled Equus quagga and no more Equus burchelli. But anyway, even when it was considered a separate species, anyone who paid any attention to this kind of thing could see that it was closely related to the plains zebra, and this similarity inspired Lutz to think some thoughts that were familiar, at least to him, and so he suggested careful breeding with the plain zebra that have been selected by their brownish basic color and reduced striping could produce an identical animal to the extinct quagga. And this recommendation has in fact been recently implemented, it's currently being implemented by a group called the Quagga Project, which in the words of its mission statement attempts to breed through a selection a population of plain zebra, which in its external appearance and possibly genetically as well will be closer, if not identical, to the former population known as quagga. If you think hard about that, you can see that it's kind of gobbledygook, but they've been going at it for a long time. They have, since they began in 1987, they have an awareness of DNA and other modern kind of insights and technologies, but actually they basically have been using the same method of backbreeding, and this is what they've come up with. This is a 5th generation foal, and you can see that striping is not really the only issue to do with whether this animal is a quagga or is wild. What is in the background there is a chain link fence, so they're not exactly roaming free over the veldt. So opinions vary about exactly what has been achieved and how good it is, let alone whether it should have been attempted in the first place. Many of the critiques echo those made of the Heck's aurochs. For example, the Grant Museum in London, which actually owns one of the few remaining quagga skeletons, says that if they want to reproduce the extinct animal, they should, what did they say? They should extract DNA from the bone marrow, use it for cloning by injecting it into a zebra egg, et cetera, et cetera. And you can see why maybe the Quagga Project has taken the low road and just tried to breed back. They're still doing it. They're producing increasing numbers of zebras with decreasing numbers of stripes. And in a sense, these objections, these kind of technical objections, are beside the point. That is, they don't address the fundamental impulse, or one could almost say the fundamental longing that motivates many de-extinction endeavors. As an American commentator for the Nature Conservancy put it, after admitting all the scientific problems, he said, herds of resurrected semi or pseudo-quaggas offered, he said, inspiration and hope. He said seeing them didn't seem terribly different than seeing bison on a private ranch or black-footed ferrets that had been introduced after captive breeding. And indeed, the criticism of the Heck's so-called aurochs and the analogous criticism of the Quacker Project hasn't even meant the end of efforts to bring back the aurochs, inspired by very similar understandings and values. Even as herds of Heck cattle continue to propagate in a few European zoos and designated natural areas, an attempt is underway to repeat the Heck's attempt, but to do it better. According to the Taurus Foundation, based in the Netherlands, the aurochs has always been at the very root of the whole idea of a continent called Europe. It is, in fact, our continent's defining animal. So using relatively recent, but not absolutely, the most recent technologies, they've developed a breed called the Taurus, which is spelled in a kind of post-structural way, capital T-A-U-R, no space, capital O-S, which is currently being reintroduced in rewilding locations in Portugal, Italy, Romania, and Croatia, even as it continues to be refined and improved. The claim is that it replicates all the benefits of the aurochs with regard to landscape and ecological maintenance, while eliminating some of its drawbacks, such as extreme ferocity, although its advocates sometimes say that people like Julius Caesar made it out to be meaner than it really was. So this makes the Taurus breeders sound a lot like the 18th and 19th century English magnates who liked to think that their unruly cattle were actually wild beasts. And since I've been suggesting that wildness, along with a set of related terms, is ambiguous and volatile, maybe they were. Thanks.